Aw, squish. What's this? Custom trailing arms on the 323 GTX? Oh, wow. Stay tuned. What I used to build these was 1 1/4 DOM or drawn over mandrel steel tubing, that's 1/8 inch wall, and then I used 3/4 and 7/8 heim joints, 3/4 for the front, 7/8 for the rear. I did have to destroy my old trailing arms to get the sleeve out for the front section, and then I had to create a shim for the rear section. As you can see, I left one complete just to make sure to get the lengths proper on everything. It should be pretty easy to set up, and plus there's going to be adjustment. Now I am going to want to put a left-hand thread heim joint on one side and a right-hand thread joint on the other, so whenever I spin the bar, it does adjust it inward and outward. Here you can see the receivers for the heim joints. This one right here without a mark is going to be a right-handed thread, and this one here with a marking all the way around it is going to be your left-handed thread. First thing I'm going to want to do is put together my heim joints so I can get my measurements for them. I am going to want as much thread engagement as possible, but at the same time I do want some adjustment, so I'll probably leave a couple threads sticking out, like so. So I will be able to adjust it inward if I need to. Whenever you get these heim joints, they are going to be covered in a kind of gooey material. And that's probably what I'm fighting right now is just a little bit left. I did soak it in brake parts cleaner and clean it out as good as possible, but it is always nice to just run it through the threads. So you can see the DOM tubing, and then we have our heim joint sleeve right here, and they just slip right inside, just like that. What we need to know is the center point to right here. 2 13/16 right there. So what I want to do is I want to measure from this center point over, which I already have. Measure this out. This just like so. 17 1/2 right there. Now I'm going to make sure to cut both of them at the exact same length, all right? So I know that there is adjustment in both of them, but at the same time I want there to be the same amount of adjustment in them. So I'm going to make sure when I cut this piece to match it up perfectly to the other one. That's how you use a chop saw, right? First you set it down on the piece, and then you measure it. See, I marked it at 17 1/2. And it's actually slightly off. That right there is on the number. Gorgeous. Now we'll get these cleaned up. What I'm going to be using for this is just an air-powered angle grinder with a 3-inch whip disc, and then I have a burr bit right here for me to get on the inside with. All right, there we go, nice and clean. What I'm going to do is mark this area right about here. As you can see, it's right before the edge of the piece. Whenever I drill this hole straight through, I'll be able to weld it, and there will be a weld here, here, and then all the way around as well. Over here at the vise, to go ahead and clamp this down, I'll be able to punch it and drill it out. But before I do anything, I like to use painter's tape, and I'll just wrap this up to keep the metal from getting all marred up and nasty before the paint job. Yes, most of the time I do use wider tape, but this is all I had in the shop, so I'm using some like inch wide painter's tape. Just clamp this down. Now that I have both sides drilled and I know that I didn't offset, what I'll be able to do is drill through both of the holes now. One thing you want to make sure before installing and welding this is chamfer this edge. Make sure is that your chamfer does not go too deep. So what I like to do is leave the tiniest flat edge right there so I know that I haven't recessed this further in. So now everything's nice and cleaned up. I'm going to go ahead and hit it with some brake parts cleaner again. Just wipe it down, make sure that it's really, really clean. But I have double checked all the threads and made sure that any of that coating that's on it to prevent it from rusting is off of it. Now it is always good practice to allow the welds to cool down. Essentially you're heating up one side and that's going to make it kick over. And even though this fits really, really snug, what I like to do before I get the first like 4 or 5 welds in is allow it to cool down in between. And this is what's actually called a thermal cycle. Whenever I'm able to touch it without it burning the heck out of me, that's when I know I'm good to go. What I'm going to do is weld it all the way through now. It's all welded up now. Not my best welds I've ever done, but it does look pretty good. Now the plan is to get this piece perfectly machined down. First, to inspect that my welds don't have a bubble in them and could potentially cause failure later on, but also to make sure that it doesn't look like a giant anymore. All right, friends, so what I've done here is I've grinded down all the welds, and I did find one spot that had a bubble in it, so I drilled it out with a drill bit, and now I'm gonna fill it. Afterwards, I'll grind that back down and then prep this whole piece for paint. We got our trailing arms sitting over here. Now these are tightened all the way down, so I cannot put them any further, so I know that I will be spinning out the same amount of thread on each side. So let's get this positioned on here. I'm gonna loosen this piece until it looks about centered on this pin, because I know that I'm already centered over here for the most part. And again, I'm just trying to get this hole centered as much as I can. I'm still going to need an alignment. Now, it's a little bit hard to do off of the vehicle, but what I'm going to try to do is tighten this piece down without this heim joint spinning.
Now it is time to make the shim for the rear section of the trailing arm, so I go over to the scrap bin and I find myself a piece of metal that is the correct thickness. After cleaning it off with a sand blaster, I'm then able to take measurements of the old sleeve for the rear section of the trailing arm, get it marked out, and then finally cut down to size. Then realizing that I had a piece of seamed metal tubing, I then decided to utilize it as my cutting points, so I marked right along the seam and then cut it to the correct width that I needed. After cleaning up the burrs from my cutting points, I then used a socket that was the exact same size as the spindle stud. I then used the bench vise to shape it into position, also using a rubber mallet to hammer it into position as well. Here you can see how round it is.
Get some grease put on here. This is going to prevent it from rusting. Also, it'll probably help everything slide together. Making sure not to get it on the inside of the threads there. That is where I do not want grease. I just want a thin layer. Now we have our sleeve. Get a little bit of grease on the outside there. And then we're going to slide this into place, just like so. Any excess, I'm going to wipe off. Here are the 7/8 cone spacers. They are stainless steel, so I don't have to worry about them corroding. Get a little bar in there. Let's tap these in. What I've done here is picked up some 5/8 by 1 inch by 14 gauge washers. As you can see, that was the gap right there. And I'm going to put one on each side. It goes sleeve, offset spacer, then washer on both sides. We're going to install this. There we go. Our little 14mm box end wrench. There it is. Nice and tight. Then we simply lift this in place. Get it fitted. Let's get a little hammer and tap that in there. And then finally, our last stainless steel cone spacer. There we go. As you can see here, the shim that I made to fit all this together is slightly shorter than the cone spacer, and I know that this is fully engaged because I'm whacking it with a hammer as hard as I can. So I know that I'm good now to tighten up these nuts and get everything all polished up. I am reusing the OE hardware since it is so specific for this vehicle. And there it is. There are my custom-made trailing arms. Not fun to do, quite complicated. But they look good, and they should hold up well. You can see how tight everything is back here. I hope you all liked today's build. Make sure you hit the like and subscribe, and you'll see me next time.
Time for funnies!
Welcome back to another episode of Khrisstian's Customs, and on today's episode, I'm making custom contrail arms. Welcome back to another episode of Khrisstian's Customs, and on today's episode, I'm making custom contrail arm. I did it again. I hope you all enjoyed today's episode. Now, my advisement before starting a project like this is, first off, have the criteria to do it. So I have quite a bit of fabrication skills in my background, and that helped me out a lot. Now, I'm not saying that not everybody can be a fabricator, but not everybody can be as good of a fabricator as me.